Welcome back to Lee TV. I am Lee Harding. I want to follow up with a video that I did on how Canadians feel about each other and also how we feel that the Canadian Federation is working or not working. More than 3/4 of Albertans believe they give more than they get in Confederation, and nearly 1/3 of Canadians agree with them. Those polled offered excessive bureaucracy and regulation for resource projects and unfair equalization formulas as the primary reasons. If Alberta thinks they're losing, who do they think is winning? A remarkable 88% of Albertans believe Quebec gets more than their fair share. So do a majority of Canadians in every province or region outside of Quebec. Even Quebecers are more likely to name themselves, at 21%, than any other province as the biggest beneficiaries of Confederation. Overall, 53% of Canadians would agree, though 24% would choose Ontario, and 17% think Atlantic Canada rides a federal gravy train. Perception is one thing, but reality is the same, at least in this case. Of course Alberta is getting fleeced by Ottawa, just not in the way you think. Oh, lovely. Albertans pay $21.8 billion more in taxes than they get back, but the equalization program isn't to blame. Well, it is partly, and I'll get into that a bit later. According to the most recent numbers from Statistics Canada, Albertans sent $49 billion of taxes to Ottawa in 2016, but only received $27.2 billion back in the form of federal spending. So that's where you get the $21.8 billion gap. That means every man, woman, and child in Alberta paid $5,265 more than they got back. So if Alberta was independent, that'd be money they'd keep. Now, it wouldn't be quite that simple, because you would have to have a military, you'd have to have a whole bunch of institutions. But at least that military and those institutions would be people that are in Alberta. So this gap between the taxes that are paid and what comes back is the largest of any province. Ontario would be second place at $9 billion. They pay $9 billion more than they get back, apparently. Although, due to government employees working in Ontario and then paying taxes to Ontario, they're probably getting all of that back later. And I'll get into those numbers after a little while here. Alberta's chief enemy right now, BC, and they're just because of pipelines, why they're saying the enemy, also has a net loss in federal spending, although it was just $4.2 billion in 2016. And for most provinces, the math is the other way around. Newfoundland, they received $1.4 billion more from the federal government than they paid in. Manitoba got a $4.2 billion surplus in federal spending. And I'll just say part of that is because Manitoba has fantastic hydroelectric power revenues, and so does Quebec. And conveniently, the formula doesn't count those when it's estimating the fiscal capacity by which a province could raise money. It's a very convoluted formula, even a convoluted concept, which is part of how they get away with this. In 2016, La Belle Province received $16 billion more from federal coffers than they paid in federal taxes. Quebec paid $50.3 billion in federal taxes, but received $66.4 billion. Alberta has 4.3 million people. Quebec has 8.3 million people. But Alberta sent $49 billion of taxes, and Quebec pretty much paid the same. But what did Alberta get back? They got back $27.2 billion. Quebec got 66.4. Not only did they get 21 billion less than what they put in, and Quebec got 16 billion more, but as far as the federal handout, it's like 244% more in Quebec than it is in Alberta. Is all this equalization? No. Far from it. It is true that Quebec rakes in more than $11 billion annually from equalization, which is more than 60% of the total. However, economist Trevor Tombe has estimated that even if the federal government scrapped equalization outright, Alberta would only save $2 billion each year. I have a master's in public policy from the University of Calgary, so Trevor is just a great lecturer. He gave one guest lecture in a class. What he's saying is that the reason that Alberta pays more is not because of equalization. Equalization, he thinks, is only about $2 billion of that gap. But Albertans are paid more. They're making more money. At least in 2015 they were, in the oil patch. Alberta had Canada's highest median income. So it's $20,000 more than the average Canadian gets. So that means you're going to pay more taxes than the average Canadian. The higher income tax rates kick in at those higher levels, So you are paying a higher percentage on that income as well, which means the federal government is raking in the taxes. Fort McMurray, even after the collapse in oil prices, had the highest median income at $76,004. I think they're probably suffering more than that now, especially because they're rationing the amount of oil that can be produced because we can't get the oil out to Tidewater. So the states know that we have nowhere else to take it, and they're severely underpaying what we would get. So then the Premier decided that they were just going to lower the amount of production in Alberta so that they could kind of raise the price of what does go out. The richest cities per capita, Calgary and Edmonton, occupy the number 2 and 3 spots. Guess what the richest city is? Government land, Ottawa. The high-paid federal government workers. This is another part of the gap I'm going to get into later. Okay, according to the Alberta government, only 55% got income from government transfers, compared to almost 69% in the rest of Canada. Yes, most of the people in Alberta, when they want to retire, they don't want to stay in the land of snow. They want to go to beautiful BC. Alberta has the youngest average age. It also has less retirees, so there's less pensioners collecting pension, etc., etc., etc. Every tax dollar collected by the federal government, 17 of them came from Alberta, even though Alberta has 11.4% of the population. That's a lot of tax. Then, of the extra $16 billion in federal dollars spent in Quebec, Albertans really, they've paid 17% of it. $2.72 billion that went to Quebec came from Alberta. Now maybe, when we have things like Energy East Pipeline, and the application is 30,000 pages, you shouldn't have the mayor of Montreal, Denis Coderre, saying, "Oh, I don't think these guys have done their homework." $19 billion for equalization. Of that, there'll be $1 billion going to Ontario, $2 billion headed to Manitoba, and 11.7 to Quebec, not to mention the maritime provinces. Now, I want to get into this chart that Trevor has. Sources of Alberta's fiscal transfers. If you were to take that $21 billion gap, or I think he has something more like 25 or 27, personal income taxes accounts for 1/3. Corporate income taxes are another part. A lot of corporations moved to Alberta years ago because they had lower business tax rates. They have lower personal income tax rates at most levels, if not all of them. That is actually how you diversify an economy, because you had all kinds of businesses setting up in Alberta. It's not through government spending a bunch of programs and money to make it diverse. Just lower the taxes and people will figure it out. They're getting CPP deductions coming out, and they're not coming back because some other pensioner who lives in the place where they are retiring is getting it. Non-defense purchases. Okay, so this is other things that, I don't know, federal government's doing. Equalization is, so what? It's only the fifth place problem in this whole thing. GST. There's no sales tax in Alberta, but they have to pay GST, so people pay GST, and all that goes to Ottawa. And they'd rather buy it in Alberta because there's no provincial sales tax, so people will buy things there if they can, and Ottawa gets all that money, and Alberta gets none of that money, at least not directly. They'll get it as a profitable business, but again, when they're a profitable business or they pay themselves out of that profit, that's getting sucked to Ottawa too. Old age security, same thing. Old age security, if we got rid of old age security, we would have a balanced federal budget. And they don't claw back any old age security until the individual in his retirement is making in excess of, I think it's about $74,000 now. They don't fully claw it back until you're making $148,000. So the poor senior is getting as much old age quote unquote security as someone of another income. It's crazy. Other factors, I can't tell you what that is. And EI payments, less receipts. Do you know employment insurance is set up? There's about 8 different districts. And if you're in a district that has had historically high unemployment, you don't have to work as long before you can get the EI. So what happens? They only work that long. Then they work under the table the rest of the time or whatever. I've heard stories of Newfoundland trawlers where they'll work for the 14 weeks or they will actually fish in ways that they can straddle kind of the weekend, and so the income and the fishing counts on 2 different weeks. And then they might work under the table on trawlers in international waters, as Spanish, French, whatever. EI payments, less receipts. You'll have to work longer in Alberta to get it because historically there's been high employment. It becomes an endless cycle where in the Maritimes you have a lot of dependency and people don't want to work longer than that. There was a joke about Syncrude being an acronym, so you Newfoundlanders can receive unemployment down east. Defense purchases. Do you think there's a lot of defense spending going on in Alberta? No, it's going to our shores. It's going to whatever. government expenditures in Alberta. I will put this in the description. You can see where they're spending money. One of the reasons Alberta works is that they don't tax the crap out of you. So Alberta population growth is faster than the rest of the country. There's more and more people there because they have entrepreneurship, because they make things happen. Okay, it's a young population. There's different stats here. And okay, more employment in higher paid occupations, trades and transport. So also the wages are higher in Alberta because you have to do that to compete. But then that means that they're skimming all the more to get to Ottawa. So there's so many different socialist ways that take the money out and bring it to the east. So Alberta and Saskatchewan, the wages are growing. In Newfoundland they were, and this is largely powered by oil. It was until recent events. It's based on 2015 income. Post-Trudeau, the income hasn't been as good. Their government expense per capita is more. So yeah, equalization takes all this money and puts it in other places, which means that Alberta is spending more because they're not getting that all that help for their health care and everything else. And then because the wages are so high because of this oil, people move and work and have business there because the taxes are low. That means that to have competitive wages there, they're paying their civil servants more. That's just the way it's going to work. So all of this means that more taxes go to Ottawa. Okay, so the prices of things are growing faster. There's faster inflation. Public sector employment is growing. Well, that's interesting. And certainly under an NDP government, it's going to grow faster. The Alberta school system is better than the other ones, or at least it has been. They had a teacher who wouldn't give out a 0, and the schools wouldn't let him in Edmonton, so the private schools picked him up. Now the NDP government is trying to remove funding for Christian schools because they won't go along with some of the LGBTQ, transgender, SOGI teaching that's going in. And they're like, this is just not compatible with Christian values. Of course, we don't believe in hate, but we can't present all morality and lifestyles and everything as being equal. And so look at this. Alberta now is spending more per capita, way more, on environmental things and climate change things than Quebec sure is. This chart shows it. So anyway, you can just take this by so many different metrics. Now let's go to where the federal government workers are. National Capital Region is Ottawa, Ontario, and Gatineau, Quebec, where the federal offices, the federal government workers are. Which again, we found out Ottawa side at least is the highest paid on average in the whole country. 113,000 people. Maybe 1/3 of those are Quebecers. Outside of that area, you have another 30,000 Quebecers. And in Ontario, you also have a lot of government workers, of course. So you've only got 15,000 federal government employees in Alberta. Alberta is still younger. Now, I'm going to do a video on this later about how our demographics, Canada is going to be in trouble because as the boomers retire, there's going to be no one left to pay. In Alberta, there's only 12.8% of the population that is senior, and the average age is younger than you'll find for any of the other provinces. All of these pension programs are going to send money to these other places. And when you look also at these government workers, the government workers get pensions that are very generous. Federally, they have a defined benefit pension, 2% times the average of your best 5 years of work times the number of years you worked. So if you made $100,000 on average in your final 5 years of work, and you worked for 35 years in the federal government, 35 times 2 is 70, you would make $70,000 a year. I think it's inflation protected for the rest of your life. And people are living long now. And where are these people going to be living? Ontario, Quebec, BC, and that money is going to go from Alberta. Unless you declared bankruptcy, you couldn't get out of these pension obligations. And this is a ticking time bomb for Canada's fiscal future. So yes, equalization, I mean, there is more that's being paid out, at least in nominal dollars. I mean, we know a dollar doesn't go as far as it used to. There's also ways they lie about inflation. Go to shadowstats.com and you can read up on that. They've lied about employment numbers for a long time. Post-NAFTA, because they started playing more games to hide the job losses, these seasonal adjusted numbers and also sort of arbitrary kinds of things, like they're not looking for work anymore, so we're not going to count them in the unemployment rates. This is who is getting the equalization. So Quebec here, yes, as a portion of the whole, is getting a lot of the equalization, but it also has the second highest provincial population in the country. So per capita, you're not getting as much in Quebec as you are some of these other places. Manitoba is actually getting more equalization per capita than Quebec is. Okay, Ontario is just getting a sliver now, but again, think about this. The federal government is taxing all of the money, but then they're giving some of it back to the recipients in equalization. If you pay in $4 billion and you get one back, you still lost $3. Again, shed no tears for them. They've got a lot of government employees. New Brunswick, huge amount per capita. Nova Scotia, PEI, also huge. Newfoundland hasn't gotten it for years, and the reason is oil. They say the one who pays the piper calls the tune. But when it comes to Canada, it doesn't. Even though Alberta is paying way more per capita, they're not getting more representation in the House of Commons. Alberta's got 34 members of parliament and 6 senators. And if it had the same representation as Quebec does per capita, it would be 40 members of parliament and 12 senators. And again, their population's growing faster. There was an estimate done by one of the banks, Scotiabank, because they couldn't get the oil to Tidewater to get it on containers and get it across the ocean. It was costing $15.6 billion a year. And there's been so many things that the Trudeau government has done between carbon taxes, regulations, different things. Some of these projects, they've mothballed it. They're like, as long as this government is in, we know this is just useless. And they don't want to say that because they don't want to burn the bridges between them and the government. But that's the reality of it. The Liberal government nationalized it. There was a court decision that was just before the vote whether Kinder Morgan should sell the shares in the pipeline to the federal government. Well, all of a sudden there's a decision that you didn't look at the whales enough and going to be delayed another 6 months to a year, and all the shareholders are like, what? Okay, you can buy it. The Americans know that we have to ship this somewhere. We're not getting very much of it to port, so they're selling at a tremendous discount because the Americans know that we have no other place to put this. So you'd think that the Federation would help Alberta, but we're not seeing that from the federal government. American tax-free foundations decided to target the oil sands of Alberta. 10 years ago they began. Rockefeller Brothers Fund, that was their goal, to just keep the oil sands landlocked and to shut it down. Oil sands production has been capped because they got the oil industry to agree to that in the name of social license, and now the social license isn't buying them anything. I hope you learned a lot from watching this. Please like, share, subscribe to my channel. Let's get this message out there because the mainstream media won't take enough time to tell Canadians about it. God bless Canada. Thanks for watching.